Hello, and thank you for joining us here today at the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility's annual webinar around Afro-Latinos in Corporate America. This webinar is specifically titled A Conversation on Race and Identity, because we'll be sharing a little bit of our thoughts and perspectives and experience with you today just about this topic. This conversation will address the unique challenges and opportunities for Afro-Latinx people working in corporate America. Here to moderate today's conversation is Marco Davis, who is not only the president and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, but also the secretary of the board for ACER. CHCI provides leadership, public service, and policy experiences to outstanding Latino and Latinx students, Latina and Latinx students, and young professionals, and convenes members of Congress along with other public officials, corporate executives, nonprofit advocates, and thought leaders to discuss issues facing the nation. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator and to welcome him to the stage, Marco Davis. Hello, Marco.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you on Pacific time. Happy to be here. Very excited to join you all for this important conversation. As Sylvia mentioned, we're going to be exploring the topic of Afro-Latinos in corporate America. In my mind, it's really a jumping off point for a conversation about race and identity within our community, right? We know that race and identity is a complex issue. Frankly, it's a social construct here in the United States. It's one about which there's a lot of opinions, a lot of perspectives, and a one around which I think our community is still growing, is frankly still learning. We're exploring ourselves, our own identity, the diversity that makes up our community, and the different perspectives. And as you all hopefully, I think, are aware, over the last few years, there's been, I think, a real significant growth in this topic of the segment of our population that identifies as Afro-Latino, Latina, Latinx, the segment of our population of African descent who and how we navigate the world and how we navigate both being within our communities, being within the larger U.S. society, and most importantly, how we navigate our workplaces, which is one of the areas of focus. So I think we're going to have an exciting conversation. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And so I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists who are joining us today. I'm really excited to have first, who you just heard from, Sylvia Perez-Cash, here from ACER. Really excited to have her join us. And I also want to welcome, and you've heard from her, so she introduced herself. And so we're going to go on to our next panelist. I want to introduce Kiana Wilson-Archbold, who is the Senior Director for GES Marketing at ADP. Kiana, good to see you, and let me give you a couple of seconds to say hello, introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. As Marco mentioned, I'm Kiana Wilson-Archbold. I am currently a Senior Marketing Director at ADP, and I'm so excited. I love this time of the year when we can have conversations like this, because in the workplace, so often we have been, as I mentioned before, put into a box. And I think that we now have a voice and an opportunity to have these conversations so that we are encouraging others to have a voice and have conversations at work where we can choose and self-identify how we want others to think of us and see us, and what conversations we should be included in. So I'm very excited about this conversation and looking forward to more of this.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Kiana. And next, I want to welcome Jeremy Clayton, who is the Creator Manager for Entertainment and Marketing at LinkedIn. Hey, Jeremy. Oh, you're muted. The classic challenge.
Mistake. I'm so sorry. Hey, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for introducing me, Marco. My name is Jeremy Clayton again. I'm currently a creator manager at LinkedIn, supporting our top voices in entertainment and marketing. I'm a proud Afro-Nicaraguan from sunny West Palm Beach, Florida. I was born and raised here and currently live here now. Prior to joining LinkedIn, I worked at HBO Multicultural Marketing, worked at Univision, rest in peace to Flama, I had a great time there, and Meta and YouTube. And I've had the privilege of being able to uplift creators of color, specifically Latino, Latinx creators. And I'm so excited to have this conversation. This is right up my alley. This is what I love to do, and I'm really passionate about it. So looking forward to, learning more from my other panelists. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Love it, love it. And as you all can see, we've got a really exciting panel of folks, lots of lived experience, lots of expertise and wisdom here in these 4 boxes on your screen. So we're excited to jump right into the conversation. So let's start off with a bit of a combination of level setting for our audience, but also sort of hearing folks' personal perspectives. So let me ask each of you, if you don't mind, why don't you share with us sort of either when you first heard the term Afro-Latina, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and or when you came to self-identify, if you didn't all your lives. I, for one, didn't hear that term until much into my adult life, but I may be older than all of you, so that may be my challenge. And what it means to you, most importantly, what it means to you, that term. And who wants to volunteer to go first?
I'll go first.
Great.
So my mother is Costa Rican. My father is African American. So I grew up going back and forth to Costa Rica, during vacation time as a child. And in Costa Rica, I was Black. And so I grew up identifying as a Black girl, a Black woman, when I became an adult. And it wasn't until, I think, very recently, maybe in the past 5 years or so, that I heard the term Afro-Latina. And it gave me comfort to be able to use that term and Latinx, because it didn't force me to choose whether I was Black or Latina. I recall when I first started at ADP, I had to identify my demographics. And in the demographics, the options were Black or Hispanic, non-Black. And another option was 2 races. So unfortunately, choosing 2 races meant that I was neither Black nor Latinx. And there was an opportunity
the other
for
category.
me.
It's an update
Yes,
on that, right?
Yes, and if you don't choose one, then you're not counted. And so there was an opportunity for me to attend the Women Empowerment Summit that's held by Black Enterprise, and I was not considered because I did not self-identify as Black. And that started that conversation at work. And they've changed the options now, thankfully. You're either Black, you can be Black or Hispanic, and not Black non-Hispanic. But it's unfortunate that it took so long for that to be an option.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That systems are often completely inadequate, and then they have real implications in folks' lives. Sylvia, I think you unmuted, so let's go to you next.
Sure, I'll share. As Kiana mentioned, that the term Afro-Latina, when I found that term, more or less, it was immediate feeling of belonging. It was the first time that I truly felt included in my own language, which is, I think, really powerful to think about as an individual. How we all know how important language is to society, to not have the words to accurately describe yourself. So in my case, I learned about this term in a book, and then it's a really pivotal book in my own personal development. It was called Down These Mean Streets by Beauty Thomas, if anybody has read it. And it is about the Afro-Latino experience in the South Bronx in New York City. And really the struggle of identifying, that person the author was Black and Puerto Rican. I am also African-American and Puerto Rican. And really trying to come to terms with how that showed up in different communities, and how the difference between being identified by your external community versus identifying yourself and being present and being visible as you want to show up. It was a very powerful narrative for me. And that changed to this day, kind of how I was able to present myself and understand myself and introduce myself to others. And so I think that sense of belonging is the most powerful piece of the language, and why I think it's really important to use the right words for one, and teach those words to others in our corporate settings.
That's great. Thank you, Sylvia. And Jeremy, same question.
Yeah, I think I also came across the term, I think it was back in like 2015, 2014. And I think it was like a YouTuber that I was just watching, and she identified herself as Afro-Latina. So that was the first time I had heard the term. And also I had a similar experience as Sylvia, where I was like, finally, there's a word that I can identify as, because I honestly got tired of just explaining to people how, I'm Black and Latino, and just like, it was just really exhausting. So having a term that could just simply say I'm Afro-Latino, and now especially people understanding what that means, it's just so much more helpful. It makes it a lot easier for me. And like growing up, I didn't really think about it, to be honest, because my family in Nicaragua, they're Black. So I just always knew we were Black. And so it wasn't really something I struggled with as a child, but now, going into my adulthood, it was just a lot easier for me to be able to communicate to others that don't really know much about, the Latino community or anything like that. So it just makes it easier.
Those are great points. Thank you all for sharing. And one thing I'm noticing, I wanted to mention off the bat, an interesting pattern that I think is just worth us thinking about, reflecting on, and for our audience to keep in mind is, in particular, I think I just heard Jeremy and Kiona, you both mentioned the important distinction between how we talk about, how we identify, how we are, as Sylvia mentioned, how we are identified by others, but also how we talk and think about our racial identity in the US versus within Latin America, right? You both talked about that. And it's one of those things where, like I said, I mean, it's maybe a conversation for another time, et cetera, but for a whole nother webinar, right? But it's an interesting point to think about, is that there's a particularly and arguably sort of unique dynamic about sort of navigating the idea of racial identity in the US, which does not play out the same in Latin America. And by no means am I saying like there isn't racism. There absolutely is in Latin America, et cetera, right? But I mean, just the categories, right? The boxes, the fact there's no fluidity, that there's no sense of overlap for the longest in the US, and that we're having to force this term Afro-Latino is literally sort of challenged, as Kiona gave that really excellent example of the idea that it was either or for the longest. And people couldn't conceive of it being both. Whereas I think in Latin American countries, at least, it was possible to be, and increasingly now in Mexico, for example, in Mexico on the census, it is possible to be both Black and Mexican. And in other countries, it's for much longer time, it's been possible to be both things. So anyway, continuing on the conversation, let's take it now to the workplace, right? You all talked about it, and Kiona gave a really good example of how it played out in the workplace. But I'm wondering, particularly starting with you, Jeremy, maybe, how has that sort of intersectional identity shown up in the workplace? What might be an example of where it's been something that you've had to address, where hopefully with any luck, maybe there's been an opportunity where it has been helpful and allowed you to enlighten? Sadly, unfortunately, I suspect we all have examples of where it's not been helpful, or where confusion is something we've had to deal with. But I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit about your experience or perspective in terms of navigating identity in the workspace.
Yeah, I think honestly, in my experience, it's been actually really beneficial. I think in the work that I do, working in multicultural marketing, as well as working with creators, it's beneficial to understand different, audiences, especially multicultural audiences. So in my experience, I've been able to, apply that to my work, and that has helped me shine in the work that I do. As well as I've been able to speak internally at, my different past employers, speak on behalf of the Latino community, and just, educate, the Latino community at the company, as well as, allies and those that are interested in learning more. So in my experience in corporates, it's been great, but I know that it is a unique experience working in more of like the entertainment field. And I know it can be different in other industries.
That's great. Thank you. And Kiona, did you want to add on to anything? I know, like I said, you gave an example, but I'm sure we live it, right? So there's probably any number of experiences and stories we could tell.
I think now that there's so much conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that it's a lot easier to have those conversations. and for my coworkers to invite me into discussions rather than making, inferences or decisions on their own. There have been times when I have, because I'm in the marketing world, have had an opportunity to look at things before it's released to the public. And I'm like, what is this? Like, you cannot release this image like this. This could be offensive, whether it's a Black or Latina or Latino. It's just, you should ask someone before you just release something. And because I'm in a position, or I've been in a position to say those things, and it has encouraged others to come to me to ask my opinion. And then I know it's my responsibility to say, I'm not the only one, right? So then I'm able to include others and bring them to the table as well. So we've been very fortunate in that there are more conversations. There have been times in the past where, you talk amongst your coworkers and you say, who let this go out? But it's gotten a lot better, and I know we still have a road to travel, but I'm thankful, like I said, that we're having these conversations so that it continues to improve.
Thank you, Kiona. That's excellent. Really appreciate that insight. Sylvia, so you have the unique opportunity to share, obviously, both lived experience, yourself having moved through your career as a professional, but also from your perch at HACER, where you all observe, you all advise much of corporate America on our community, right? And so you potentially at least have had that broader lens to sort of see. So I'm wondering, have you seen any trends, as Jeremy and Kiona have mentioned? Is that consistent with what you're seeing across the board? Are there any other particular features around the conversations that HACER has with the corporate world that are worth sharing about sort of how this topic is increasingly on the radar screen, as was mentioned?
Oh, can you hear me now? I would just echo that we do see many more companies as integrating these conversations about intersectional experiences into their DE&I strategies, and particularly where HACER focuses on the data, really taking a look at the data infrastructures in your companies, very similar to Kiona's story in the opening. And what are the questions that you're even asking? Are you collecting the information you need to identify those intersectional spaces? And let's remember that in this conversation, we're talking about race and ethnicity, but intersectionality really cuts across all types of social identifiers. And these are all constructs in their own right, Marco, as you pointed out. And so where we really focus on are those opportunities to look at your data sets, to look at how you the cross section of those data sets, and think about how that information can further inform your strategies around career pipeline development, your executive leadership teams, your community relations, right? Your corporate boards, when you think about the future of your company and the markets you really want to authentically be able to understand and connect to. So that is where I would say not only is where we see a trend, but also continues to be a large area of opportunity for corporate America in this space.
Super helpful. So one of the things I think that I've seen has been super helpful in navigating sometimes thorny, but almost always sort of issues that are sort of not in the employee handbook, right? Issues that are not sort of basic sort of workplace, obvious workplace practices. I find our interpersonal relationships, right? And sometimes those are organized and helpful, like ERGs, employee resource groups. And sometimes that's just person to person. And I'm wondering, have you all found opportunities to create community within your workplaces, for example? Are there enough of us, of the Afro-Latino, Latina, Latinx population within your workplaces that you've seen folks gather? Or again, have you had opportunity even to engage with one individual one-on-one? In particular, I'm wondering about sort of younger-ish, you all look very young to me. So other young people early in their careers, let me say, since you all are leaders, right? an opportunity to mentor, do you hear anything? Do you see anything different from them? Have there been opportunities where you've been able to engage with folks, either to commiserate, right, or to feel solidarity, or even to unite your voices to sort of raise the perspective within the corporation? As you all have mentioned, there is a need to bring this to the attention of corporate leadership, right? And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for strength in numbers, which would also indicate in my mind that things are changing in terms of the makeup of the talent profile. If anybody wants to volunteer.
I would say that at ADP, the ERGs that we have, so we have an African American ERG, Cultivate, and then we have a Latinx ERG, Adelante. And so both of those really provide a platform or a stage, a community for employees to join and have conversations like this, to mentor, to vent, and to really, as you mentioned, provide a community for employees to feel like they are not alone. And so that has been very helpful. And also, as I mentioned earlier, to offer that confidence for those younger employees who may not have it to speak up for themselves, right? And to do it in a way that is practical and not considered aggressive, right? But confident. I keep saying that word, confident, but I think that plays such a huge role in the way you show up at work. And if you get to a place where you have the brand where you can have the conversation, it makes it a lot easier than someone who is, fresh out of college or fresh out of school or new to the job. So I do think that those ERGs play a role, as well as just, social. It's a little bit harder now because a lot of people are not in the office. So those platforms, because they allow for virtual events, you can connect with others who are thinking like you, who may have similar challenges as you, and have those conversations.
Super helpful. Thank you, Kiona. And Jeremy, I know you've got, there's quite a few employees at LinkedIn. It's quite a sizable workforce. Tell us a little bit about the experience there with either ERGs, like I said, or individual connections.
Yeah, so unfortunately, like Kiana mentioned, I'm remote, so we don't actually have an office in South Florida at all, but we do have a lot of employees that are down here. So we do meet up. We meet up for happy hour sometimes. I've had the pleasure of meeting other people and other Latinos specifically. Not as many Afro-Latinos, so it does speak to more so like the representation there. But I can speak to about LinkedIn, creating community and opportunities for employees, with specifically Black and Latinx employees to, grow and build community. I'm a part of a program right now, the LEAD program, which is basically an executive leadership program. We have monthly, almost biweekly sessions to, basically train us on, owning our story, dealing with imposter syndrome, leveling up, all of those great things that it takes to, level up in your career. But we also get to learn about each other and just, share our stories and bond. And so it has been really great to meet other, Latinos and Black employees in the company. But I've also had great experience at like Meta, which is they have a lot of great ERGs. They fly all of the employees, like the Black employees, out for a summit, and the Latino employees and the LGBTQ employees out to Menlo Park for a summit. And even outside the summit, like, the ERGs in each office, they play such a huge role. I used to live in Austin, Texas. It was so hard for me because there are not a lot of Latinos, especially not a lot of Afro-Latinos. So it was really hard living there. But the ERGs really, fill that void that I had. So when I walked in the office, it felt like, I was in a very diverse community, and I saw faces that looked like mine. So those ERGs have been really important.
That's great. Sylvia, anything to add? I know it's a little bit different at Hacer, given the role that you play, but you may have had, again, experience through all the corporations you all work with. Oh, you're still muted. You're still muted, Sylvia. Sorry.
I focus on those opportunities for education. And when I think about those different ERGs, and not only kind of coordinating, collaborating as ERGs, whether you're in the Black ERG or the Latinx ERG, and doing events together, but also educating across, within membership. I don't think we can make assumptions actually that every single member who identifies as Black understands that the cultural diversity within the term Afro-Latinx, as well as if other Latinx employees understand the different experiences that we may have as people who show up and present as Black, externally, and that there's a lot of things that we sometimes choose not to share, right? That I don't have to explain all the time. It just is as part of my perspective. And I think those opportunities for education are just really critical for corporate culture. Never mind, of course, extending to any other allied group who really wants to understand and be invested for any number of reasons. And so thinking about the ability to coordinate, the ability to share information, and to not make assumptions about kind of base level exposure to this concept. There's just so much diversity even within the Afro-Latinx term, cultural diversity, that there's a difference between African American versus Garifuna versus West African, what have you, and all of us show up externally potentially viewed as the same, but internally very different ways that we identify and communicate that same label. And so I do think that space of treating the approach, the ability to say every opportunity is a teachable moment, and integrating that into your corporate structure is really what ERGs are very powerfully positioned to do.
And Marco, I saw a question in the chat about, there were some really interesting comments in the chat. One about ERGs and corporate environments still have a long way to go in an effort to include Afro-Latinos because they've been excluded for so long. The interest is low. And also another comment, being an Afro-Latino of darker skin, do you find it more difficult to be accepted by others with a lighter skin color? And I'd like to respond to that.
Yeah.
What I would say is that in the environments that I've been in, we've been the minority, right? Whether I'm a Black or Afro-Latino or just Latino, we are the minority. So we are joining these ERGs because we're looking for commonalities, right? And so I'm not saying that every person is embracing me for who I am, but I do believe that the ERGs are a safe space. And yes, they have some ways to go, but it is a safe space where I feel like I can be my authentic self, which is very important to me. And, I do find that you may not know that I'm Costa Rican by just speaking to me. But once you join this group and we start sharing about ourselves, and you learn that that's something else that we have in common. That's something else that I have in common with the members of the Latinx group at my organization. And so I do find that that's comforting, and it makes me feel like I have more power in numbers than I may have had by myself.
Super helpful. Thank you for bringing that up and for responding to those comments, Kiona. Jeremy and Sylvia, did you want to mention that, or any comments added to that in response to those commentaries?
Yeah, I would say that I've always felt welcomed, with Latino ERGs. But I also have made sure I put myself in those positions to, be present and participate as much as I could. I do understand, and I have felt a little bit sometimes where that, a little bit of exclusion, just because, people obviously ask, like, do you speak Spanish? And then for me, that's like one thing that when I was younger used to bother me. But now, like, I'm able to confidently say, like, my family, like in Nicaragua, we're Caribbean people. So like, I can explain that we don't speak English at home. My family does speak Spanish, but our first language is English, is a Caribbean dialect. So I think more so it's been more of the language barrier as far as like not being able to speak Spanish fluently. I'm still working on it. But yeah, I think that has been more of an issue than more of like my skin tone.
That's great. Thank you. Sylvia, anything to add? You're still muted.
All right, I should pause first. I do think colorism is real, and I'm glad for the question. You know, it does impact relationships and the social relationships that people form. Although I also think that, you know, the more you know about the community and the more you're open to presenting yourself and kind of showing up, as Kiona said, using these affinity spaces to build the communities and connections and to seek out those areas of commonality, the less you'll have to kind of carry that burden of colorism all by yourself. I think that you see it in corporate America, and you know, especially when you're looking at, you know, companies that are drawing from Hispanic talent from all over the globe. If you take a real hard look, you're not going to find a lot of Afro-Latino leaders in executive C-suite positions or on corporate boards. They're very few. I mean, we're few everywhere, but they're very few, especially at those top leadership positions. So even thinking about how that pipeline development process is executed in other countries and, you know, other places, other national headquarters for a workplace, has, you know, you have to understand the social construct of those countries too, and you have to understand how colorism plays a role in even how the advantages that somebody would have to qualify for these roles that then position them into these US-based senior leadership positions. So it is a very complex system with lots of roots, right, obviously in history and in these constructs that look different across countries and across communities. I will say, you know, for myself, I think even regionally in the US, also taking into consideration that not every US community, the Latino and Black population relate the same way. And so even kind of thinking about that opportunity to understand the relationship between those communities and how it shows up in your workplace and the opportunities for education. I think that's kind of the point I really want to emphasize, that this is a space for shared education across all of these places, our personal communities and our workplace communities as well.
Thank you each, actually, for sharing all of that. Two quick things I wanted to mention. One is you all are already beginning to comment, I see, which is great. We'll continue to address and respond to those comments. Do want to highlight, we're going to switch to sort of a Q&A format where we'll focus even more on the comments that we're seeing in the chat that you're putting in. So think about your questions, or go ahead and start queuing up your questions so that we can tackle those topics. The other thing I was going to mention briefly, and I think Sylvia really hit the nail on the head there, which is it's useful to keep in mind, one, that the ERGs, much like corporate workspaces, much like all of our society, made up of humans, right, who are human and fallible, right, and that sadly, you know, racism in America, and I'll say this because I don't work for a corporate entity where I know it can be touchier, right? Racism permeates our society, unfortunately, right? And we're all, as they sort of say, it's sort of a disease that infects, sadly, everyone, truly everyone. And so we have colorism. I didn't mention in my introduction that I also, perhaps obvious to folks, but worth mentioning, I also am Afro-Latino. I am of both Latino and Black descent. And therefore I have moved throughout my life in both communities. And so, quiet as it's kept, there is absolutely colorism, and that is a challenge in the Hispanic community. There is colorism in the Black community as well, just as there is even biases that play out as a result of colorism with the way in which non-Black folks treat folks of varying hues from the Black diaspora, right? And so all of these places aren't perfect. But again, as folks have mentioned, it sounds like there's at least places where people can build community, people can learn together, people can try to address and surface the challenges that some of us face in a way to at least together in community be able to tackle those. All right, one last topic I wanted to mention before we switch fully to trying to respond to some of these awesome comments and questions that are showing up in the chat. But given that we're talking about sort of you all, I should say, being in corporate America, we've talked a fair amount about sort of how it affects us individually and how we sort of work internally, I would argue, in the corporations, in the corporate world, in terms of the workforce. But I'm wondering if there's a dynamic, if there's any components or any examples or insights you all can share in terms of how your identity or how the presence of Afro-Latinx employees potentially has helped the corporation move forward looking externally, right? As it thinks about its external audience and constituency, right? When I think about two things that come to mind, for one is, as was just mentioned, when we talk about internally in terms of the workforce, also externally in terms of gathering any kinds of demographics. I know many corporations are increasingly trying to get better and more accurate and more complete data on their customer base, right? On their constituents, on their website viewers, on their purchasers, right? And so I'm wondering if there's been any conversation, if you've seen or heard any of that. And then the other one that's, of course, most often referenced and talked about is, have there been any opportunities to think about, for example, what kind of image the corporation presents to the public vis-a-vis, for example, its marketing, right? Are we finding ways, are you seeing or hearing of examples where folks think about the story that the company tells about its brand and its inclusion and its appeal to a broad audience? Has this same concept of the Afro-Latino segment of our society surfaced into those conversations yet, to help essentially these corporations reflect a more realistic portrait of America? Right, that's what I think would be most beneficial for society, but hopefully also for the corporations themselves. So, any thoughts on that?
I don't know that the conversations are being had specifically about Afro-Latinos, but I do know that as we are creating marketing, we are intentionally looking for diversity in our images, in the way that we speak, etc. And so if you have a picture of people sitting around a table, then we want to make sure that there's diversity in age, diversity in gender, diversity in race, and making sure that we look like we are inclusive, because we realize that if we want to broaden our client base, we need to make sure that we are representing that what we have today is also what we're looking to attract for the future. And I think you can say the same thing for the talent within the organization, right? Very often you want to make sure that when you have an interview panel, that the panel of people who are interviewing are as diverse as the slate of candidates that you're considering. So again, I don't know that it's specific to the Afro-Latino community, but it is definitely diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know that's a really broad stroke, but that is definitely something that is top of mind in all of the decisions that are being made in the circles that I've been in.
That's great. Thank you, Kiona. Anything to add, Jeremy or Sylvia? Yeah, Jeremy.
Yeah, I'll agree, especially when it comes to representation for Latinos. Most of the time I'm hearing that, like, hey, we need to make sure we have an Afro-Latino person included. Like, that always comes up. Now, when it comes to hiring, I do think that might be something that should be looked at more. Not an HR expert, just want to say that, but would like to say that, like, with the data now, when you apply for a job, you can select race and ethnicity. I would like to see more, numbers around, like, the promotion and the career development around Afro-Latinos, because, I'm pretty sure there's a different experience for Latinos that can, assimilate or, look closer to, their white counterparts. So I think that's something that I haven't really seen much of or had seen conversations about, and I would like to see more about that. But yeah, for the most part, there, for representation and marketing purposes, there definitely is always a conversation about including Afro-Latinos, in my experience.
That's great. Great. Anything to add, Sylvia?
Slightly different, Ben. Because I hope I waited long enough that time. Because I'm not the marketing expert, I really appreciate the comments of both Kiona and Jeremy on that front. But to say that what conversations that we're having around this space is the importance of not just representation, but also authenticity, and thinking about the vendors that you're using to help you create your multicultural content, as well as the leadership on your teams that's reviewing it and providing that feedback and that internal advisory service to make sure that the presentation that you are creating is coming from a very authentic source. I think that cannot be overemphasized, as it's something that's very valuable, and I think is getting very warranted, but much more attention than it used to get. I will also share that in this space, we talk to a lot of corporate leaders, and Hacer is very proud of our ability to share a lot of those stories with our membership and with our stakeholders in an effort to, again, broaden awareness of our experiences in corporate America across the board. And I will say that I wouldn't say a lot of numbers, but I would say on more than one occasion, I've heard a story of a white presenting Latino making a choice to reveal that they're Latino, making a choice to reveal that they are a non-white, they have a non-white identity. And that is something that as an Afro-Latino, we don't, or any person who doesn't present as white, doesn't have that opportunity, that choice, that privilege of choice is part of racism in this country, where you can choose whether or not you want to be identified, how you want to be identified, versus being identified externally from the beginning. And so I think kind of for companies to really think about that, and for individuals who may have shared that experience to think about the power that they have when they choose to kind of reveal themselves, when they choose to show their accent or not. And the same power, on a different type, the same power comes along for us when we choose to show up, not just as presenting as Afro, part of the African diaspora, right, but also as Latino. And I think, Kiona, your story really resonated with me in particular. Like you show up and nobody is going to guess that you're Costa Rican. And Jeremy, you too, I bet nobody's guessing off the bat that you're Nicaraguan or Marco Mexican, right? Sometimes people do guess I'm Puerto Rican because of the way I look sometimes, right? But it's a choice that we get to make. And that choice, while it doesn't have the same impact, I think, in our career trajectories, just because of how racism plays out in the workforce to this day, I do think it's just as powerful to be cognizant of when you show up and when you do make that reveal, that it's empowering somebody else and it's creating space for somebody else to also show up and to be themselves. And so I would just leave it there in terms of representation in that front.
Thank you for sharing that, Sylvia. Really great insights. And thank you as well, Jeremy and Kiona, for your thoughts. And on that point, in terms of the importance of representation, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and shout out my friend and colleague, Sid Wilson, who you all hopefully know leads Hacer as its president and CEO. And he is the first one always to point out that he was the first Afro-Latino selected to lead a national Hispanic nonprofit organization. And to our knowledge, we're still waiting for someone to tell us that we're missing folks. To our knowledge, I'm the second, right? And we don't know of other folks yet. We'd love to find out that we've accidentally overlooked and that there are more, but we have yet to come across them, at least at the national level, which again, it just points to some a need of where we all have a long way to go, not just in corporate America, but even in the nonprofit world and many other places as well. All right, so turning to some of the questions, there's quite a bit that we've seen, that we've gotten some comments here. One I want to ask, I want to mix it up a little that I think might be interesting. We'll see what you all answer, but someone mentioned, and hopefully folks have noticed and been aware that there is a recommendation that has been forwarded for the upcoming census, for the 2030, I guess, census. They plan well ahead to get their census in order, to actually shift the way the question is asked. If folks aren't familiar, the short version is up until the 2020 census, for the last one or two or possibly three censuses, there were two separate questions. There was a question asking a person to identify their race, and the only options were white, black, of indigenous descent, or Asian Pacific Islander, right? It was those four choices. And then there was a separate question unrelated to those four options. There was a separate question that said, are you of Hispanic heritage, yes or no? And they found, particularly in the 2020 census, that there was a surprisingly high number of folks who checked yes on the Hispanic. Sorry, I forgot there was 5. There was other. And there was a surprisingly high number of individuals who answered the question on the census, yes, I'm of Hispanic descent. And on that earlier race question I mentioned, they checked other. They checked none of the four primary racial, it's all a social construct, racial categories, right? And so one of the solutions that, in fact, the Biden administration, I believe, is the representatives who submitted this for comment, I think, is to consider collapsing those questions and essentially to have Hispanic, Latino, Latinx be one of the options. So now a person would have all in one question. And you could check more than one box is the other piece it's worth noting. And to Kiona's point, it would not be other check more than one race, but rather a person could check white and black, white and Asian, white and indigenous, and therefore Hispanic would be one of those alongside. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. If you're interested and care to share, if you think that's a good idea, if that's a bad idea, why, what you think about it. Go ahead, Sylvia. But yeah. Oh, go ahead, Kiona. Sorry. Sylvia started talking. I saw, but she was.
Yeah, I did. I keep debating to be unmuted. So I'll jump in and I'll say what I think is most important is that we always challenge how data is collected. And I think there's a narrative in there, that as a researcher, and the census, of course, is a significantly important body of research, right? And that we have a number of our institutions are tied to that. How we allocate resources to communities are tied to that data. So how we collect that data has direct implications on investment on the ground, affecting people's lives, affecting companies and businesses, and all of that. It's part of a system. And so there's
a super important point I want to, before you continue, because I thank you for saying that, Sylvia, because I think, and if I can just interrupt, but because I really want to underscore that point for us to think about, because people sometimes often interpret this idea of what you should put on the census as simply a matter of self-expression, right? Which I think obviously it's extremely significant and important, self-expression and self-identification. But you just mentioned, I think, a thing that sometimes gets overlooked, which is that government makes decisions and allocates resources based on the aggregate of those responses. And so it's one thing to simply say, I want to express myself in some way. I want to reject a binary paradigm and choose other, et cetera. Absolutely, that's important. But understand that dollars may or may not go to your and other communities based on, and if the government, and again, if the question is imperfect, we're going to get imperfect data, and therefore resources will be allocated imperfectly. So please continue, Sylvia, but I really wanted to mention that because I think that often gets lost in the census debate.
Yeah, thank you. And I mentioned that to say that I think it's important to challenge, however you feel about this particular proposal at this time, the idea being that the more granular we can get in our data, the better, right? And that you cannot use the excuse that, well, we've been collecting this data for X number of years in this way. If we change it now, we won't be able to make comparative analysis. We won't be able to understand change. I mean, that is a narrative that you're going to hear a lot when you think about challenging the way that data is collected. But the way that it's collected is part of a system, right? And so you can't make change on the macro scale without changing the system. And I think it's just really key to that. And the last thing I remember, and I'm sorry I'm not a little bit more prepared in particular on this question, but for the last census, there was an entire campaign in Puerto Rico specifically to get more Puerto Ricans to identify as Black. Right. And so, and when that data came back, the percentage of the Black population in Puerto Rico jumped up, and I know I'm going to get this number wrong, but I'm going to say like 2 or 3-fold. And it's not to say that more Afro descendants somehow moved to Puerto Rico or were born in Puerto Rico, is that people actively changed how they identify, because there was a whole campaign to educate them on what that identity means, how it's a part of Puerto Rican history, how it's a part of the culture. And while the idea of not selecting Afro-Latino was really a part of white supremacy in Puerto Rico, right? And so there's a whole educational campaign that of course changes, again, Marco, as you're saying, the allocation of resources to Puerto Rico, based on how that information is interpreted by our government. So I just think, overall, it's important to always keep an open eye, never be afraid to challenge how something is presented, because that presentation needs to be changed. Is particularly in this space as we grow as a country around anti-racist movements.
Super great. Thank you so much for that, Sylvia. I really appreciate it. Kiona, Jeremy, anything to add on that? If you want to touch that topic, or if you're undecided, that's totally fine too.
I couldn't agree more. I work for a company where data is so important. I think most of us work at companies or work for organizations where data is so important. And if you don't select something, other means you're not counted, right? And so we need to make sure that more people feel included and feel counted in order to to make sure that we're representing them, whether it's in resources or other areas. And so it wasn't until I had to choose Hispanic only on that form for work that I understood what it was like to feel like I wasn't represented. And so I don't want others to feel that way, right? You want everyone, especially since many of us probably have family members or friends who have several ways that they can identify themselves. There's so much intersectionality. And so we want to make sure that they are included and counted, not just included, but counted.
Yes, I agree. I honestly think that race and ethnicity should definitely be separate. Just because I want people to be able to say that they are Black and Latino. Like I think those two things are, and I want them to be able to say that they're white and Latino. I think that's important as well. I think those, that data is, like you said, Sylvia, it's political. So I want to make sure my people, especially my Afro-Latino community, that they are identifying as Black as well, because that's going to help the Black community in general. And so they have to be aware that, they are a part of that community. And so, I agree with making sure that, I really don't really understand the other option. I get some people don't want to identify maybe, but I think we should make it possible to where it's hard to choose other.
That's great. Thank you all. And if I can take a quick second, even though I know we don't have a lot of time, just in the interest of public education and public enlightenment, it should be noted it was a lot less covered because it's I think, relatively speaking, smaller population. But there is a proposal, I believe, alongside that same one about that, to actually add an additional category, which is MENA, if folks don't know, which is Middle Eastern North African, because there is also a community and a movement to really recognize that that is a particular population that doesn't fall under Asian American, that doesn't fall under African American or of African descent, right? And to allow for that population and that diaspora in particular in the US to be able to be found and identified. And speaking of giving everyone a chance to find themselves in there. All right, we've just got a couple of minutes before we have to wrap. And I know there were lots of questions, but what I want to try to do, maybe if I can, to try to do some justice to these many questions, is to maybe ask you all if you can share a little bit back on the personal side. I feel like a lot of the questions we heard were on the personal side. And so something along the lines of how do you navigate folks who don't understand or appreciate intersectionality, right? Whether it's your employers or your coworkers. Are there other resources besides ERGs, and sometimes even within ERGs, where you're forced to choose one or another, or folks, even if you're not technically forced to, there's generally a sense that folks are pressuring you to choose one or another group, right? Or are there other resources besides ERGs where folks can look to for information, for support, for ideas? And I think maybe the last sort of twist on this question that maybe each of you can speak to is just how do we continue to educate non-Afro-Latinos about our population? How do we help more folks understand who we are and be more supportive allies? Whoever wants to go first, we'll make your attempts to answer any or all of those are closing final comments.
Sylvia, do you want to go?
Well, Jeremy, you go ahead.
Okay. So I would say, to answer your last question, more so about educating others, I think starting doing what we're doing right now, just speaking more. I know specifically for me, it's something I'm really passionate about, being from, my family being from Bluefields, Nicaragua, where again, it is a very unique culture, and a lot of people don't understand that I am Caribbean as well. So I love Carnival. I love Caribbean culture. My family does speak in a Korean dialect, so it's a little bit, confusing for people, but I think the more I talk about it, I think that is helpful. So any chance that I get, I do educate others on my culture. I think that's something that we all can do, is just continue to talk about it. And, whether it's, on social media or just with your friends, your friend group, I think that's a good place to start.
That's great. Sylvia, if you want to unmute, there you go.
I'll jump in again. I think that I leverage my personal identity and the personal experiences that I had growing up. I'm from Washington, D.C. at a time when the city was 80% African American, and really feeling like the the Latinx and Black community at that time were just one and the same. It's kind of just how I grew up, and that's that's a mentality that I have. And so I think that where that shows up in this education, this need to educate others, that I start from that assumption all the time that there are more commonalities and there are differences between our communities, and that it's my goal to help facilitate visibility about the similarities and those connections, whether it's experiences. And I mean, even if you're talking about legally and like how race is constructed, if you look at kind of the civil rights movement around Chicanos and against Chicanos in California in particular, because I live there now, I'm more aware of that, to the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the African-American community, you'll see more parallels than not just in the actual laws that were passed at that time. And just the target community was different, right? I mean, and so I think that where I stand is that space of education really is coming from an assumption that we are all one, and that our experiences as marginalized identities are more common than they are not. And that's a starting point that I have for any conversation. And again, I do think it's important to have them in your personal spaces, but as I said, to show up and make room in your workplace and your professional places as well. Mark, I'm really glad that you commented on the nonprofit space and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion National Network as well, where the diversity in that space, even in a field that's very committed to diversity, there's a lot of work to be done. And so I just think showing up and using our voice is probably one of the most powerful tools that we have.
Thank you, Sylvia. And Kiona, you get the final word.
I don't have very much to add to what's been said because I think that it's spot on. The one point that I would make is take advantage of the fact that people are willing to listen today, right? 5-10 years ago, we were not having these conversations at work. We weren't really having them in our personal lives, I don't think. And so the fact that people are willing to have the conversation, they feel compelled to have the conversation because of the environment post George Floyd, it's giving us an opportunity to have it, for people to listen and really embrace the similarities that exist across the board. So, we've been given a microphone, use it, and continue the conversation, not just during Black History Month, but throughout the year, so that, it becomes a part of everyone's lives and not just the lives of Afro-Latinos.
Very well said. Well, thank you each, Sylvia, Jeremy, and Kiona, for your insightful comments. Two quick things I'll mention to finish up on my point in terms of takeaways, what I heard that I thought was super useful. One of which is it's certainly not fair. It shouldn't be this way. But I think in the absence of a more enlightened world, it's on us to be the teachers, right? I think I heard you each sort of say that. I think one of the only ways we're all going to learn and people are going to make fewer mistakes and act on those mistakes even less is if they are, in fact, more educated, more enlightened, more understanding of our communities, of our culture, of the diversity that exists. And so in some ways, again, while it's unfair to have that extra burden, at least until we have a better solution, it's on us to educate our peers and to share with them and to highlight that. So really appreciate. And I actually think I've forgotten my second point, and I know we're also out of time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sylvia to close us out. And I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Sylvia.
Great. Well, thank you, Marco, and thank you, Kiana, and thank you, Jeremy, for joining us today and sharing all of you sharing yourselves and your stories and your perspective. HASER organizes this type of space with the expressed intention of raising our voice and creating visibility for the different aspects of the Latinx community in corporate America. So really appreciate you engaging with us and being a part of that journey with us. I want to also kind of add that in addition to webinars, HASER offers corporate membership and opportunities for Hispanic and corporate leaders and allies to meet, creating more affinity spaces and tools and best practices and policies that companies can explore and execute as they deepen their investment in a corporate culture that, as Kiana said, includes people and counts them. It's not one or the other. And I just really love that terminology. I'll also share that we have some upcoming events that I'd like to quickly share with the community right now. We have our upcoming executive Programs Conference from June 12th to 14th in San Francisco, our Symposium Conference, the Power of Hispanic Inclusion in October, as well as our Leadership Pipeline Program in New Orleans this year on October 24th, 26th. All of these opportunities are real affinity-based